Okay, so let's talk a little bit about two-dimensional arrays. Two-dimensional arrays, a one-dimensional array stores a list of elements. A two-dimensional array, you can kind of think about like it's a table. So if this was an array of one dimension, this would be an array of two dimension with a series of rows and columns. To declare a two-dimensional array, you specify the size of each dimension separately. So we'll use two sets of square brackets. So in the first square brackets is the number of rows, and in the second is the number of columns. And then to get an element out of that two-dimensional array, you just reference it with two square brackets. Again, the row and then the column of the element you want to receive. So if you're using a two-dimensional array, you will typically also use nested for loops. The outer loop iterates through the rows, and the inner loop iterates through the columns. So let's take a look at an example here. If we have a two-dimensional string array called table, we declare it as string bracket bracket. Okay, so this is a two-dimensional string array. And then when we initialize it, we say we want 3 rows and 5 columns. So the rows come first, columns come second. If we wanted to fill this array with the strings that you see here, so the strings basically represent the row number, comma, and the column number, starting obviously with 0. We'd have an outer loop that would go from 0 to 3, not including 3, because it's going to iterate through rows number 0, row number 1, and row number 2. And then we'd have an inner loop that's going to loop through the columns, so columns 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We would then fill the cell at row I, column J, with the particular string indicated here. So again, that first index is the row, second index is the column. Again, we start at 0 for the rows and 0 for the columns. So the way that Java actually stores two-dimensional arrays is as an array of arrays. So Java doesn't actually store it as a table, but it actually stores it as an array of arrays. So what we can think about as this table that we created here, which I think as humans it's easiest to think about like a table, how Java actually stores it as an array of arrays. So it stores it as an array with 3 elements, and what's stored at each one of those elements is an array with 5 elements. Okay, so actually how this stores this is that this whole row is an array of 5 elements, and that's stored at position 0. This whole row is an array of 5 elements that's stored at position 1. And this whole array of 5 elements is stored at position 2. So Java actually treats this like an array of 3 elements, and each element holds an array of 5 elements. Okay, so I find it kind of tricky to think about an array that way, but what's nice about that is that you can actually pull out a whole row at once using a single index. So if I were to reference table at position 1 with just a single square bracket index, I'm going to pull out this whole row. So if I wanted to pull out a whole row of data as an array, I can do that by just referencing the row. Okay, so you don't have to think about two-dimensional arrays this way, but if you want to access a whole row at once, you can do that, and it's because Java actually stores them as arrays of arrays. Okay, so you can always access the number of rows by the length field. So table.length is going to give you 3 in our example. It's going to give you the number of rows. And if you wanted to know how many columns are in any particular row, you can access that row by just using one index. So table at index at 0 is going to be that whole 0 row. And if you want to know how many columns are in that row, you could say table at 0.length, for example. Table at 1.length is going to tell you how many columns are in the first row. Okay, so we can get the number of rows by just doing the two-dimensional array.length, and the number of columns in any row by accessing the row and then .length for the number of columns. So if we had here a grade book, for example, this has students as the rows and weeks for particular grading assignment as the columns. Okay, so this would be a grade book as you might traditionally think about it. We could initialize that by saying we want a two-dimensional int array. We're going to have 7 students, so 7 rows, and 5 assignments, 5 columns. Now we can use a lot of different ways to fill this with values. We could use a nested for loop. We can also use some initializer lists. So let's say we know all the grades of student 0. these are student zero's 5 grades. So let's just create an array called student zero that holds these 5 integers. And then let's store that array at gradebook position 0. So gradebook position 0 is this. It's the 0th row. That sounds funny, the 0th row. And that is an array with 5 values. So I'm going to say at the 0th row of gradebook, store this array. Again, this is accessing that idea that Java uses arrays of arrays. Okay. Student 1, this is the array of student 1's grades. Let's store that in gradebook position 1. Gradebook position 1 is a whole row. Here I'm giving you what that row is. So this is another way that we can fill up a two-dimensional array. We could also just use a nested loop. That works too. But if you have all the data that you're putting in your two-dimensional array, like we might for a gradebook, this is a great way to do it, right? Because we use these initializer lists to create each row, and then we just stick that row in the table. Okay. Now, if we wanted to print everything out, great way to do that is with a nested for loop. So that outer for loop is going to cycle through the rows. The inner for loop is going to cycle through the columns in each row. Okay, so here we're using the length variables to do that. Our outer for loop goes from row 0 up to but not including the number of rows, which is gradebook.length. Our inner for loop, so this is going to be for each row, for row 0, for row 1, for row 2, etc. It's going to start at column 0, and the number of columns in that row is gradebook at row dot length. Okay, so this is going to say from column 0 to 4 because there's 4 columns in each one of our rows. So this is a structure you can use to iterate through the rows and columns of any two-dimensional array using the length variables. And then if we wanted to print out the element at that index, we would just print out gradebook at row and column. And if we want to have a line break at the end of each row, that would go inside the outer loop, but outside the inner loop. Okay, so this system.out.println, which is printing a new line, is going to print at the end of each row. Okay. So in addition, we can have more than just two-dimensional arrays. We can have any dimension. Okay, so we could have a three-dimensional array, a four-dimensional array. You can also have ragged arrays, which means that if you just had a two-dimensional array, for example, the rows don't have to be all of the same length, like a nice table. It could be ragged, which means each row might have a different number of columns. You can do lots of things with multi-dimensional arrays, but my general rule of thumb is if you can't picture it in your mind, maybe stay away from it. I can't picture what a four-dimensional array would look like, so I'm probably not going to use it in my program because it's just going to be very likely I'm going to make a mistake because I can't draw it out on paper. I can't picture it in my head. So two-dimensional arrays can be very, very useful. You start getting into more dimensions than that, even though Java will let you, it might get a little tricky with actually using it properly. All right, so we'll pick it up in a moment.